I'd like to welcome you to this introductory presentation before the uranium panel here at the African Mining Summit. And I was asked to talk about really nuclear, its future, and how it positions with Africa and the uranium, the resources that are in Africa. And I just really start with the concept that power and growth are linked together. And this is clearly highlighted by the slide here, which is showing, the night light. And it's interesting how in the highly developed regions, we have these bright lights out there, but in other parts of the world that are still developing, we still have relative darkness. And we're going to consider the factors that are needed to take us forward to fill in that space. How do we fill in that dark space going forward? We're going to look at economic growth. We're going to see how that ties together with population growth. Another big factor affecting Africa particularly is this rate of urbanization that's coming through. And the country continues to be plagued, or the continent, I apologize, the continent continues to be plagued by access to energy problems and energy security. But Africa is full of regional resources. It is abound with commodities. And then lastly, we're going to look at nuclear reactors. I'd make one point just looking at the map of Africa. It is interesting to know that there is that threshold there on GDP of about $100 billion of GDP is where the lights come on. And it just shows you how far Africa has to go as a developing continent to catch up with its global peers. And for power, you need growth, and for growth needs power, and the two are interlinked. These stats are taken from a number of sources, and namely the BP Energy Report. And the chart on the left-hand side is really just showing that link between your Human Development Index and the consumption of energy per head. The more developed your region, the more developed the country, the more energy it consumes. It's interesting to see that the highest ranked African country has actually got an HDI of 75. It hasn't even got to the plateauing point yet. And there are 36 countries in Africa with an HDI less than 0.6, right at the bottom end of that. And when you're looking at that, and you're looking at 1,000 kilowatts per hour, 1,000 kilowatt hours per year of energy consumption. You look at Nigeria there at half of that level. In the Western world, that is your basic expectations. But people want a fridge, they want a dishwasher, they want an oven, a television, an iron, and some light bulbs. That is your basic position that you're looking as you go forward for luxury items. That is the basic stance. So what's been going on over the last 10, 20 years? Interestingly, sub-Saharan Africa has been growing. Over that period, it's grown 27%. You compare that to the other major developing regions of China's up 136 and India up 71%. But it's interesting that the population growth has actually matched it in sub-Sahara. The population is growing so fast that when you look at it from an energy growth per capita point of view, sub-Sahara energy growth per capita is actually flat. It is not growing at all. You're growing at the same rate, and therefore you won't see the overall growth rate that you're looking for that total continent to come through, which is why where places like India and China are developing and growing their GDP, because they're ensuring that their energy growth is greater than the population growth. So as I was just commenting on the previous slide, Africa's energy growth is not enough. Africa has increased its energy by 24% between 2010 and 2019, but the population grew 27% over the same period of time, whereas China and India's GDP growth has been supported by strong increasing in energy per capita. So where to from here? The problem actually gets worse, because the population growth forecast is substantial for Africa. By 2020, we're going to reach a level of 1.3 billion people in the continent, increasing a further 26% by 2030, which will exceed the expected population of China. And by 2040, you're going to have a population growth of 55% forecast. At the same time, large parts of that population are moving from a rural site into the urbanization. And urbanization is causing its own people. As people move into cities, they expect to have power. They want those luxury items. They have more access to that. And your problem is when access to energy in the total sub-Saharan environment is less than 50%, and rural Africa is down at 30%. So you have more people, increasingly urbanization and increasing demand for power, but access to power continues to constrain. And Africa has to deal with these problems against a backdrop, a new backdrop, an increasing pressure backdrop of climate change. The Paris Accord has come out, which pretty well 189 countries have signed up to and are committed to, which are looking to keep global temperatures below 1.5%. The only way to do this is to achieve the balance between emissions by sources and the removal of sinks for greenhouse gases. And the problem for Africa is it is the continent that, according to the UN and many other departments, is the continent that's going to be most affected by global warming. But it's the continent that actually currently produces the less CO2 emissions. But at the same time, it is the continent that produces the least amount of power. But if you look at the chart on the bottom right-hand side, Africa's problem is going to get worse. As it tries to grow, and if it continues to grow along the path that it's currently following, its CO2 emissions per person, per kilojoule of energy produced, actually are some of the highest. So if Africa continues down the path it's already generating power, it actually will become one of the largest CO2 emitters within the globe. And that's not where Africa wants to be. It has signed up to the Paris Accords. It needs to change the way it's operating. So Africa's problem has got an energy mix that's CO2 rich. It's strong in coal, it's strong in oil, and it's heavy in gas. And when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, and you take out the North African countries, it gets worse because now you're looking at coal and you're looking at oil. And these are the big CO2 emitters that are out there and needed to be dealt with going forward. So how does Africa grow its power? It's got to look at its resources. Africa has to be self-sufficient in where it goes from power source point of view. And we're seeing this all over the world with different commodities where countries are realizing globalization is great, but you have to have access to the critical resources that you need to grow your environment, whether that's in rare earths or whether that's in power supply, with the arguments you've had in the US recently on uranium. Africa has plentiful supplies of coal, has plentiful supplies of oil and gas, and they're scattered predominantly throughout the total continent. The biggest problem that we have is that while they're substantial relative to the generation rate we have today, they're not if the growth rate accelerates substantially above where it is. These resources are not going to be big enough, and more has to be met. And then you've got the comment I made previously that, fine, you can focus on these resources you have, but unfortunately, you're going to increase the emissions of CO2 and therefore exacerbate the problem of climate change on the continent most expected to be impacted by it. Okay, so let's look at what the alternatives are to the carbon-rich fuels. We have hydropower, provides clean energy option, and it's experienced through Africa already. There are many dams across Africa on the major rivers that are there, and it's a major power source in many regions. But the problem with hydropower as we move forward is, firstly, it's becoming more political. Rivers are crossing borders. We're seeing this already between Egypt and Ethiopia as they spat, while Ethiopia wants to put another dam and Egypt doesn't like it. You're seeing the similar problems where Nigeria is having to make payments into the countries that have want to dam the Niger River. So politics is becoming an issue. And then back to the issue of climate change. It's all about the amount of water that comes down. And we're already seeing this impact over the last few years of climate change impacting water levels that has been causing reductions in hydropower and causing brownouts in places like Zambia and South Africa. These are aging assets as well. Many of them are well over 50 years old, and new dams increase the risks, increase their risk exposure to environmental changes. These dams cannot act as batteries either. When times are dry, you can't just store water going forward. And for many countries, They are already a major energy source, and really you can't expand beyond where you already are. Renewables is obviously one of the options to go. Solar power is clearly readily available across the whole continent. And if you look at the chart on the bottom right-hand side, Africa represents one of the best opportunities for solar power. But the problem with solar power and wind is it's intermittent energy. It's not there all the time. And power grids must be designed to be flexible. Also, increasing the percentage of interim power increases higher costs and increases the results of grid instability. But there are financing options available to do this, and it's an increasing chance with different scales coming through. And it's becoming a well understood process, particularly in the case of solar, on how to finance these energy projects. I would comment on the wind as well, that while it is there, it is clearly not a great option to go forward for most African countries. The volume of wind is not substantial, and not a lot of energy is going to come from that source. So what about nuclear? You know, it's the one energy source that people tend to leave off the book. What nuclear does, though, is provide a very solid base load of power. It is stable, clean energy. It actually produces some of the cheapest energy sources out there. And you can't just look at the cost associated with that generation. You have to look at the bigger picture that is out there, the scale of the grid, the interconnections that are coming through. These all have to be built in to how nuclear fits in. It's also one of the highest energy sources per meter squared. I mean, the table at the bottom, for every square meter you have, a nuclear power station will produce 1,000 watts. A wind farm will only produce 2. That's a lot of space you're going to have to put in place if you're going to follow wind. And even solar will require a lot of space. And an increasing focus on the environment, is it right to cover the land in solar farms to cover energy, if that's the way you want to go? And as the chart in the middle highlights, you know, we're trying to deal with an energy demand that is very volatile. You've got peaks in the day, peaks at night coming, and troughs coming through as night. And while there is some balancing between commercial and residential, you'd still get these large peaks and troughs that have to be dealt with. One thing that Africa has is uranium. It's scattered across a number of jurisdictions. Whether you're in Niger in the Timisoy Basin, you're in the Karoo Rift Valley that comes all the way through from Tanzania into South Africa, or you've got the vast uranium projects in Namibia. Africa already produces 16% of the world's uranium, and it has a number of potential areas to start exploration and develop it going forwards. But the one thing that has stopped nuclear energy really getting going into Africa is its scale. Somewhere like the Hinkley Point plant that's currently being built in the UK, its 2 reactors will produce 2.6 gigawatts of power. It's approximately 7% of the UK's power. A single one of those units will produce 9,700 gigawatt hours of energy. The recommendation from electrical engineers is that for grid stability, you would not want a single energy source to exceed 10% of your total demand. Therein lies the problem. There are only 2 countries in Africa, and what this chart is showing is annual energy generation by country. And rather than putting the country names, I've ranked them by the total energy globally that they're ranked against. There are only 2 countries in Africa that currently can handle a traditional nuclear power plant. And therein lies part of the problem of trying to get nuclear into Africa. But nuclear is changing as well. Nuclear is finding new ways forward. And you'll see a lot talked about. And a lot of countries are now starting to look at this, which is the evidence of a new, smaller modular reactors. Why are they so important? They are small. They go all the way down to 10 megawatts, up to 300 megawatts. So you can have these small, even off-grid structures coming forward. They've been designed to be fail-safe. They're designed to be more flexible. Because of their scale, they can be fitted on to existing grid systems. there are no major overhauls of grids to be done. And because of their scale and the fact that we're expecting to be able to build these in a centralized factory location, we're expecting to see a much lower construction cost coming through. From a safety point of view, they're pretty well sealed units and only need to be refueled on long extension times, unlike the larger reactors that need to be refueled every 2 to 3 years. So this is a way forward for Africa to get into nuclear. In addition, the nuclear industry is looking at the ways it can create a greater benefit to the communities it's in. It can't just be about generating energy. It has to create more flexibility. And that is part of what is being designed into the new SMRs. They have to be flexible to handle working with the renewables. But at the same time, nuclear energy is looking at other potential areas. Can it go into centralized heating? Probably not appropriate for Africa, but other things like the generation of hydrogen, which can then be provided into synthetic fuels, into the transportation market, into home cooking, into fertilizers. This creates new business opportunities from the energy that's available for those countries. And as what we're also seeing is that potential to create jobs. Nuclear creates way more jobs than any other energy source. And then creation of employment is important, particularly in Africa. And then other areas, particularly as well, desalinization. It's an energy intensive source. Why not use nuclear for it? It's always there. You always want water. Nuclear is always there as a base load. And I have to touch on this because one of the criticisms is always laid against us, we're not safe. Well, we are. The nuclear energy is one of the safest energy sources. And this is really highlighted by this. This is per 100 deaths. So there are 9,000 over the last 50 years, total deaths associated for each of those. And look at how many people die related to the coal industry. The wind industry and the solar industry kill more people than the nuclear industry. The other issue that people always talk about is the safe disposal. There are many examples out there of subsurface disposal. I've provided one here from a company called Deep Isolation, and their approach is to drill deep holes over 5 kilometers down into the ground and deposit these containers down there, which are 14 feet high, 9 inches wide. That will contain a whole year's reactor power source, and it's gone. It's below the water table. It's safe. It can't be got hold of. So nuclear material can be disposed of safely. Governments have just got to be willing to look at it and appreciate that. But it's a clean, safe energy. And it would be wrong of me not to at least put one slide up for my own company. As the CEO of Goviex Uranium, we are an African-focused uranium company. We've got a substantial mineral resource. We have exploration potential in all of our targets. We have a development team. But the key for us is we have 2 fully permitted projects. One in Niger, which has been mining uranium since the early 1970s, and one in Zambia. And Zambia is one of those countries that is looking to go into the nuclear sector to generate power, which it needs so much for its development, and particularly its copper industry. And our focus at the moment is very much on the development of our Modular project in Niger. And I'll be at my booth during this conference. If you'd like to come along and talk to me, be very much appreciated. So I just summarized where I came from on this whole thing. The African continent is one of the largest and fastest growing populations. As I pointed out, by 2040, it will exceed China as a population. It's seeing massive urbanization and an increasing demand for individual power consumption with increasing GDP. But it's got an energy mix that's wrong. It's a CO2 heavy energy mix. And it's a continent that's the most impacted by global warming. So as the continent tries to increase its energy, it can't keep that mixed balance going forward. It has substantial resources that it can try for clean energy, including hydro, wind, and solar. But don't forget it has uranium, and nuclear can be there to generate substantial energy for the development of Africa going forward. And I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, and we'll now turn to the panel discussion. Thank you.